You are listening to the Cycling Podcast in association with Rapha, the fastest clothing in the world tour, the home of cycling with character. Ride and watch with Rapha in 2019 as they partner EF Education First and Canyon SRAM.
Happy 6th birthday, Lionel and Daniel.
Thanks, Rich. Thanks. It's been a tough paper round if we're only 6.
Yeah.
Is that true?
We were six yesterday, the Cycling Podcast. It was 6 years ago yesterday that a few days before that we sat in Hyde Park and recorded a podcast on my iPhone.
So yesterday was the official birthday because that was the release date of episode 1 of the Cycling Podcast in 2013, just before the Tour de France.
And thanks to Moeen Islam for spotting that anniversary. Thank you, Moeen. If you could just put a little reminder in your diary, we can do this every year. How are you both, Lionel and Daniel?
Yeah, not too bad. Napalm?
Yeah, good. Yeah, the tour is rushing at us. I feel like I've got quite a busy couple of weeks before we head off to Brussels, Rich. A lot to do between now and then.
A couple of secret assignments, haven't you, Lionel?
A couple of secret assignments, keeping my fingers crossed that both of these assignments come off.
I think one of them will be delivered into the ears of friends of the podcast before the tour, if all goes well.
If all goes well, we'll release it maybe 2 or 3 days out from the tour.
I am looking forward to that one, Lionel.
Yes, so am I. I wonder what my opening question should be. Anyway, Francois Thomazeau will be joining us again. 3rd year we've had Francois on the Tour de France, so we need to prepare his nest in the back seat of the car.
I think he'll like it this year.
Are you taking a bike, Rich, this year?
I'm hoping to get a folding bike, but watch this space for news on that, Lionel.
Okay.
Speaking of news...
Yes. A couple of things just to pick up from last week. Firstly, I mentioned our event in Brussels on the eve of the start of the Tour de France, July the 5th, 7:30 at the Brussels Beer Project. I said go to the website, the Brussels Beer Project website, to get tickets. You don't need to get a ticket, actually. It's first come, first serve. So just pop along, and if you want to find out the address of the Brussels Beer Project, go to thecyclingpodcast.com/events and you'll be able to find out all the information. Richard, Francois and myself will be there doing a kind of a live Tour de France preview.
Orla's hoping to pop along. Maybe Daniel can pop along Possibly. As well. Yeah, and it's actually on the same street as the Rapha pop-up store in Brussels, and we're hoping to pop in there as well.
Indeed. And another huge omission from the news roundup, Chris Froome may well end up being the winner of the 2011 Vuelta a España.
No. Get away.
Yes, well, this is old news now, isn't it? But while Froome was in hospital in France following his crash before the time trial stage of the Dauphiné, it was revealed that due to basically biopassport irregularities, Juan José Cobo, the winner of the 2011 Vuelta, beat Froome by a handful of seconds, may well be stripped of that title. It's not actually official yet. Juan José Cobo has a month to appeal the UCI's decision. He has given an indication, certainly through the media, that he has no intention of contesting the decision, but protocol is such that he does have time to do so. So it's not actually official at the moment, but it looks like Froome could be awarded the 2011 Vuelta just before the statute of limitations, the 8-year statute of limitations for anti-doping offences lapses. So a really unusual case, this one, Daniel.
And he is a milkman now, apparently, Cobo.
And a surfing instructor,
and a surfing instructor. Not the first flying milkman in professional cycling. The other one being, I think, Frans Verbeek in the 70s was also nicknamed the Flying Milkman, was he not?
No. But an unusual case, this one, that it's taken so long to come to light. We understand that this case has been rumbling on for as many as 4 years, so it's taken its time to come to light, and as a result of biological passport abnormalities spotted over a period of time leading up to and including the 2011 Vuelta. So that's the case, and when you think back to how that Vuelta really launched Chris Froome's career. I mean, remember, he was on his way out of Team Sky in 2011 and had his contract renewed, and of course went on to finish runner-up in the Tour de France to Bradley Wiggins the following year. I mean, a real kind of a significant race at the time, and one that now looks slightly different.
Here's a theory I have. If Cobo hadn't been in that race, I think Bradley Wiggins would have won it.
Yeah, well...
Because it was Cobo that sort of drew out Froome in a way and made it into a kind of battle of who was the best climber, in a sense. And I think team orders would have constrained Froome and consigned him to a supporting rule of Bradley Wiggins. I think. I don't know. Who knows how history might have...
History might have been very different.
Might have been very different, exactly, yeah. Anybody see George Bennett's tweet about Cobo following this news? The Jumbo-Visma rider, of course, New Zealander. He tweeted that the following year he'd been sitting on a plane going to the Middle East, I think, beside what he describes as a fat mechanic from Movistar, or so he thought. It was actually Cobo. And he said or suggested in the tweet that it was an open secret that Cobo had been a doper, and that he was, he moved to Movistar on probably quite a big contract as a Vuelta winner, and didn't really do anything else, and drifted out of it and became a milkman, apparently.
Yeah, what's interesting is that it looks as though he's going to lose only some of his results in between 2009 and 2011. That was the period that was referenced in the UCI statement, and he will lose the Vueltas in those years. Seems a little bit curious. There's not much information. Well, there's no information about why that decision has been taken to only strip him selectively of results. In one sense, it does make sense, because you can imagine that, I don't know how long he was in the leader's jersey in that Vuelta, but he was certainly finishing high up in stages and was probably tested quite a lot in that Vuelta. So it's conceivable that they would have had more samples, or quite a lot of samples from those Vueltas, and that gave them reference points to check other tests that he'd done in the same period.
Yeah, he was in the red jersey for the whole of the final week after winning stage 15 of the 2011 Vuelta. Let's not forget, the first sort of time we really were that aware of Juan Jose Cobo was in the 2008 Tour de France. Remember Ricardo Rico, Leonardo Piepoli, they were both stage winners for the Saunier Duval team in that tour, both later stripped of those victories for doping. Cobo was second to Piepoli on Hautacam that year and inherited that stage win from his teammate. They finished first and second in the same time, or half a minute ahead of the rest. Yeah, and so now, that Vuelta, that 2011 Vuelta, looks very different as a result. But like I say, that hasn't actually been confirmed yet. On with the rest of the news from the world of cycling. Well, last week we talked a lot about Tom Dumoulin and his knee injury following his crash at the Giro d'Italia and the implications that might have for his Tour de France. Well, we now know that last year's Tour runner-up, Tom Dumoulin, will not start the race for Team Sunweb. Another loss. They're dropping like flies, aren't they, in the days leading up to the Tour de France? It could be a very open tour. We'll talk about how the start list is shaping up in this week's podcast and who's looking good and who's looking less than good. The Tour of Switzerland had offered up a few clues. Egan Bernal of Team Ineos won there, 19 seconds ahead of Rohan Dennis. Bernal won the big mountain stage on Friday. Other stage winners over the weekend were Yves Lampaert of De Koning Quick-Step won the time trial. That was a surprise-ish result for me. And Hugh Carthy of EF Education First won the final stage, putting to good use that form he got in the Giro d'Italia, I think. So Bernal, the winner of the Tour de Suisse, Rohan Dennis second at 19 seconds, and everyone else 3 minutes and more behind. Patrick Conrad of Bora Hansgrohe took third place on the podium. The other warm-up race in the south of France, the Route d'Occitanie, used to be known as the Route du Sud, won by Alejandro Valverde, who also won a stage there. He beat two Colombians, Ivan Sosa and Rigoberto Urán. Sosa won a stage, and Arnaud Demar of Groupama FDJ won the two flatter stages. In the Netherlands, Dylan Groenewegen and Caleb Ewan are warming up nicely for the sprints at the Tour de France. Groenewegen won a couple of stages, Ewan won the final one, and Mike Turnison of Lotto NL Jumbo took the overall there. The Tour of Slovenia was won by Diego
Did you just
Ulissi.
say Lotto NL Jumbo?
Yes, I did.
See, we have to interrupt you occasionally, Lionel.
When I make a fundamental error 6 months into the season, I'm still calling them by their last year's name. What Jumbo Visma? Dear me, it's because I've been reading stuff over the weekend about last year's tour, and it's going to take another week to dislodge some of this stuff. But I will say Orica Green Edge are looking good for the tour this year. Diego Ulissi won the Tour of Slovenia. He also won a stage there. Who else won stages there? Pascal Ackermann, Luka Mezgec, Giovanni Visconti and Giacomo Nizzolo. The European Road Race Championships were won by Davide Ballerini and Lorena Wiebes ahead of Marianne Vos. Marianne Vos back in action after her crash at the Women's Tour. And some news away from road cycling, some big changes for the World Cup track coming up in a year or so's time. The World Cup will move to the summer in 2021. This is ahead of the Bumper World Championships, which will be held in Scotland in 2023. So they're trying to shift the track calendar, but it's been played up as a kind of a big, revolution for track cycling, moving it to the summer and cutting the number of World Cup rounds down from 6 to 3, and also making trade teams ineligible, which is a bit of a slap in the face for teams like Hoob Wattbike, for example, who've really been upsetting the apple cart. But the World Cup will be open only to national teams from, I think, from next year, but then the calendar changes come in the following year. It seems like a regressive step, that, rather than a progressive one. What do you think, Rich?
It is literally a regressive step, because track cycling used to be a summer event, and the World Championships used to be integrated, didn't they, road and track, until the separation and the track cycling moved to the winter, which I thought made sense. And it meant that some of the track World Cups, you would have some of the stars of the road, Elia Viviani, people like that, taking part maybe occasionally, Mark Cavendish, if they were preparing for the Olympics the following year. In some respects it makes sense because the Olympic Games are in the summer, but I think that also restricting the World Cups to national teams, as you say, it is a real slap in the face for ambitious teams like Hoob Wattbike, who, what's the point of their existence now, in a way? If they don't have that stage to perform on, what is there for them?
Yeah, they tweeted, didn't they, that they'd beaten the French in front of David Lepatillon, the UCI president, perhaps politically had a counterproductive move to beat the French track team. But it seems to me that what track cycling needs is greater competition, not less competition. And rather than placing all of the control and all of the power in the national federations, it should be open and a landscape on which innovative teams, and Hoob Wattbike aren't the only one, but teams with having to make really creative use of their resources can challenge the national teams.
And it means also that from a publicity point of view, the World Cups will go up against roads events that are going to get a lot more. They're going to soak up all the coverage, and they'll be feeding on ever more small scraps, I suppose. You made the point about the track World Cup events and their predecessors taking place in the summer. That, of course, was in an era where most of the velodromes were outdoors. Now many countries have indoor velodromes, and so it's a strange move to have indoor cycling going on when presumably the weather would be nice outdoors. And you make the point about the Olympic Games, yeah, quite, but that's a kind of a performance challenge that the national teams going to the Olympics have become adept at coping with. They have the World Championships in the spring and the Olympics in the summer. It's been fine. World records still get broken at the Olympics. The riders manage to time their peaks for the summer once every 4 years. This just seems like belt tightening to me from the UCI. Maybe the difficulty of getting enough venues to host World Cup track events, but that's speculation on my part. But that's what it looks like.
Hey Palm, can I add a couple of items to the news roundup?
You can.
Very
yes.
uncharacteristic, I know, but the Baby Giro, an extraordinary edition of the Baby Giro, was won by Andres Ardila of Colombia. Extraordinary because out of 9 stages, 5 were huge mountain stages, and the time gaps really reflected that. So Ardila won by over 4 minutes. Now, if you remember the time gaps at the end of the Giro, the real Giro, a couple of weeks ago, how many riders were within sort of 10 minutes of Carapaz, who won quite a number? But the The general classification really reflected how hard that race was. 4 stage wins for Colombians, 4 stage wins for British riders. Ethan Hayter won the first 2 stages, including a 3.6 kilometre prologue time trial. Fred Wright won another stage, and Matthew Walls won another stage. But the Brits didn't really figure in the general classification. You're just talking about track racing there. I mean, it just reflects the fact that there is another very good generation of British riders emerging. A lot of them seem to, they developed a lot of their skills on the track. Fast riders who are going to probably win a lot. Maybe we'll see sort of more one-day specialists in the generation that's coming next of British riders.
How many of the top 5 overall will have received a phone call from Gianni Savio this week, do you think?
Another bit of news, again, with a British angle. Madison Genesis are closing, aren't they, at the end of the year?
This is very.
I said it was uncharacteristic. I've been in the United Kingdom for 3 days, and look what it does to me.
Soaking up the domestic,
the local
news.
culture.
Yeah. I was going to mention that Madison Genesis. I mean, they've been one of the stalwarts of the British scene for a decade or so, and coming to a close at the end of the season. But we don't cover the kind of under 23 cycling.
Come on, the Baby Giro should be front and centre.
I think it was evident during the Giro that there was a lot of interest in the Baby Giro, wasn't it? Somehow this year, I think maybe because 1 or 2 performers from previous editions of the Baby Giro were performing well at the Big Giro.
The fastest clothing in the World Tour, the home of cycling with character. Ride and watch with Rapha in 2019 as they partner EF Education First and Canyon SRAM.
I like the bib shirt of Rapha because they're really comfortable. My name is Alberto Bettiol and I race for Team EF Education First. Yesterday I also tested him in the cobbles and they are pretty good. No have any issue about it. So I'm looking forward to keep on riding with the Shemi of Rapha, and I recommend all of you guys all this bib shirt.
Thank you very much indeed to Rapha, our headline sponsor. I mentioned earlier that Rapha have a pop-up store in Brussels. So if you're over for the Grand Départ of the Tour de France, why don't you pop in and see? And we're planning to go there at some point as well for the couple of days that we're in Brussels. It's going to be nice, isn't it? A couple of days in one place. It's a real sort of Eddie Merckx tribute. Stage 1 is a road stage starting and finishing in Brussels. Stage 2, a team time trial through Merckx's backyard, isn't it? It's the Eddie Merckx stage, isn't it? Stage 2.
Yeah, I'm not. I feel like I'm not very well versed in Eddie Merckx. A long time ago, I wrote a book about it.
You'll know that it goes past, the house that his parents had, and it's his old school and his old, the parks he played in, etc. It's going to be.
Go past the bench where he used to drink Thunderbird as a teenager. No?
Well, I'm not sure about. We'll have to check that one, Lionel. Listen, we are looking ahead to the Tour, and the races that we've been watching have offered some clues as to what to expect. But it's a very kind of mixed picture, I think. And as you said, Lionel, it's a very open-looking race at the moment. Egan Bernal, I mean, he did win the Tour de Suisse, as most of us imagined he would, especially after Geraint Thomas crashed out. But I must say, I found his performance not as convincing as I thought it would be. I don't know whether to be sort of more impressed by Rohan Dennis than underwhelmed by Egan Bernal. It's hard to tell. Dennis, who's had a really quiet season, rode exceptionally well, and I think he won the opening time trial, didn't ride quite so well in the time trial that was won by Yves Lampaert, which was perhaps because he was digging so deep on the mountain stages. But I think if he's wanting to develop as a stage race rider, a very encouraging performance for him.
Yeah. Is this the hipster's take on Egan Bernal, though? I don't know. I couldn't.
Well, it's hard to tell whether, as I say, it's hard to say exactly what Bernal's performance indicated in terms of his form going into the Tour.
No, and this is the kind of perennial debate, isn't it, around the importance of the Dauphiné and the importance of the Tour de Suisse. Traditionally, the Dauphiné has been a better indicator of Tour de France success, certainly in terms of riders winning the Dauphiné and going on to win the Tour de France. I think I'm right in saying it's only ever happened twice in Tour de Suisse history, or since the Tour de Suisse has been held in this pre-Tour slot. Anyway, 1974, Eddie Merckx won and then went on to win the Tour, and 2001, Lance Armstrong won and went on to win the Tour.
Controversial Lance Armstrong.
Well, did he go on to win the Tour?
Well,
that's a whole
he did
question,
go on to win
it?
the Tour. He subsequently had the Tour result stripped. I don't know whether you heard, Rich, but he did a fair bit of doping, old Lance Armstrong.
Oh my God, first Kobo, now this.
But the Tour de Suisse is a funny animal, really. When you look at the start list and you look at the top 10, other than Bernal in the top 10, who is the sort of rider that you would think is going to be troubling the top 5 in the Tour de France? I had high hopes for Enric Mas of De Koning Quick-Step, and certainly De Koning Quick-Step had shown a lot of faith in Mas, saying right from the start of the season he would be their man for the overall at the Tour de France, and he was only 9th, nearly 5 minutes behind Bernal, and he was way up the road on the day that Bernal won, and looking pretty rickety, to be honest, wasn't he?
I just like that. I wondered what word you were going to... Rickety is a good one, I like it. He did look rickety.
Well, it was cobbly as well, wasn't it? So he was undoubtedly rickety. But I mean, Rohan Dennis is not...
I imagine if we could... He would have been rattling as he went over those cobbles.
He was rattling, whereas Bernal was really racing, wasn't he? Because he hugged the sort of inch and a half of smooth guttering. But yeah, Rohan Dennis, that was a very good performance. But are we really thinking that Rohan Dennis is going to be a contender for the Tour de France?
No, I wouldn't have thought so. And he's talked about going for stage wins at the Tour de France, but it almost... Well, Dennis, he's a rider who people have speculated could become a general classification rider over the last couple of years. He's moved more in that direction, hasn't he? But again, based on his time trial results, it almost looks as though he's moving towards a compromise, which we've seen time trialists try to strike in the past, where their climbing has improved and their time trialing has suffered. But the key to reading Dennis's performance in the time trial might be more along the lines of what Rich said, that often the specialist time trialists in the stages beforehand are saving themselves for the time trial and produce these stratospheric performances which are maybe a little bit misleading, whereas with a GC focus, obviously you have to be on it every day, and that seems to be the case with Dennis in Switzerland. The way the tour route is set up this year, we talked about it last week, how difficult it is. I'm pretty convinced it's going to turn out to be one of the hardest tour routes we've seen in the last 15 or 20 years. It might not be the right year for Rohan Dennis to be targeting general classification in the Tour de France. That might be a year or two further down the line. You
mean he needs more of a sort of 2012 Bradley Wiggins style
I think
race?
So, yes.
Yeah, I can see that. But Rich, you talked about Bernal and the old adage that you can only beat what's in front of you. He's distanced people he should distance by 3+ minutes. I would say that's the sort of performance you would expect. I mean, what more did he need to do? He didn't need to do any
Dennis
more.
Dennis is the curious sort of the person in the equation that messes it up here, because he might have won the Tour de Suisse by 3+ minutes, and then you'd be saying, well, this is the form rider going into the Tour. He looks great. It's just that measuring him against Dennis is confusing it, making the picture a bit more muddled than it would otherwise be. And maybe that's just confusing. I mean, I remember going into the time trial, a lot of people were saying, oh, Dennis will take the jersey back in the time trial. But as it turned out, Bernal wasn't that far behind Dennis in the time trial. Now, Bernal's a strong time trialist. I mean, he's a strong all-rounder. And I mean, he will ride well in the time trial at the Tour. He'll benefit probably from the team time trial as well. And I would say, despite that slightly confusing element, Bernal would be my favourite going into the Tour de France, I think.
Just a note on Bernal's bike handling. Probably everyone's seen on social media or when watching the race live. He kept it upright, didn't he? Going round a left-hand bend from a wider road into a narrower road, nearly put it onto the grass. And
well, that's the other question about Bernal, though. And there was this jokey picture going around on social media as well of him wrapped in, not cotton wool, but clean bubble wrap. Yeah, wrapped in bubble wrap ahead of the Tour, because he is vulnerable to that. He's had a few nasty crashes. A crash in training this year, crash at San Sebastian Classic last year, which wasn't his fault at all, and then a crash at the Tour of Catalonia last year. To win the Tour de France, it's better to not crash, and and that's the one sort of area where I think Team Ineos, with both Geraint Thomas and Egan Bernal, will be nervous.
But and you know, if we think that his Tour de Suisse victory was less emphatic than we imagined it might have been, are we also overlooking the fact that he has had in the last 12 months 2 quite serious accidents? You know, what mental toll has that taken? What physical toll has that taken? What toll has that taken in terms of missed racing? You know, for a guy who hasn't done that much racing in his professional career, he's still only 21 or 22, isn't he?
22.
But we talked last week about the way Fuglsang had kind of almost followed a sort of Team Sky-esque run up to the Tour de France with consistent stage race results, but also winning a monument, winning Liège-Bastogne-Liège on a really savage day as well. That was a hard race, really bad weather conditions. He kept it upright as well when he could have had a nasty crash on a descent. When you look at Bernal's season, 4th in Colombia back in February, he won Paris-Nice, 3rd in the Tour of Catalonia, and winner of the Tour de Suisse. That's pretty much plotting a near perfect way to the Tour de France, and including some time off the bike with a broken collarbone, recovering from that. So
I think people get it in their head still that in order, for a pure climber to win the Tour de France, they have to be able to be capable of producing these incredible, emphatic demonstrations in the way that maybe Pantani did 20 years ago, or other climbers have done in the past, Bahamontes and Charlie Gore. And maybe we forget that cycling's changed. There are fewer kilometres of time trialling now, and actually we've seen quite a few climbers win Grand Tours in the last few years without necessarily putting 2 minutes into people on big mountain stages.
When's the last time we saw a pure climber win the Tour, though? Probably Pantani.
Yeah, I mean, you could argue Carlos Sastre was he was a pure climber. Andy Schleck, Andy Schleck definitely wasn't a time trialist. No. And Contador himself was good.
I think there are lots of echoes of Contador and Bernal. I mean, I think this could be like 2007 in a way, where Contador won that Tour, albeit in unusual circumstances, but that was the race where he showed how dynamic he was, and I think Bernal is like that. They even look quite similar. They ride the bike in quite a similar way, I think, and I think Bernal in 2019 could be a bit like Contador in 2007.
And it does have the feel this year, the way it's shaping up, of a generational shift, of one of those transitional tours, or the tour that's going to start, or it's going to mark the beginning of a dynasty or a new generation.
Yeah, the one sort of puzzle for me is the bell curve of form leading to the Tour, and where the Tour of Switzerland sits relative to the Dauphiné on that bell curve of form, and whether or not, you know, I mean, we don't know how good Bernal was last week, because it's really hard to read those results. It's really hard to even watch how he climbed on the Gotthard Pass and say, well, I mean, he looked good, but it was impossible really to put that into some kind of context. And so, yeah, I mean, he's going into the race, he's going into the Tour de France, I would say, as the best bet for Team Ineos over the 3 weeks, when you look at who else they've got. I mean, he's got more in the pros column than Geraint Thomas has got this year, and where he may be inexperienced, he does have the benefit of riding for a team who know exactly how to get a rider through 3 weeks of the Tour de France. They've done it not just with one rider, but with multiple riders, and so yeah, I'm not going to object if somebody wants to hypothesise that Bernal is the pre-race favourite before the start.
Chute à l'arrière du peloton, cycling podcast team car at the back of the pack, please.
How would you like a free case of craft beer?
Yes, please.
Not you, Richard. It's for the listeners, this. If you are a cycling podcast listener, our friends at Beer 52...
Well, chances are you are, if you're listening to this.
Okay. Well, our friends at beer52.com would like to offer you the chance to get a free case of craft beer. All you pay is the £5.95 postage. Go to beer52.com/cycling to claim your free case. With the Tour de France coming up, perfect opportunity to get the beers in, to have a beer while watching the Tour.
It's a Boston theme this month, a different theme every month with the Beer 52 beers. I get my box, and in my latest box, I last night had the Clown Shoes Chocolate Sombrero, which is a stout. Clown Shoes is a brewery in Boston. I'm not a huge stout drinker, but this was very tasty indeed. I enjoyed it.
Well, the thing about the Beer 52 selections is that there's a tremendous variety. You get a chance to taste a variety of different types of beers, don't you?
IPAs, wheat beers, lagers, stouts. Yeah, it's everything, and you can customise your box if you like light beers or dark beers. And as I say, I like the mix actually, because I like to try things that I haven't tried before. So this stout was very tasty indeed.
With your free first case, you also get a copy of Ferment magazine and a snack delivered. There's no minimum commitment. Just take the free case if you want and try the beer, see what you think. And if it's not for you, you can pause or cancel any time. Go to beer52.com/cycling for your free case for $5.95 postage. That's beer52.com/cycling.
Well, we're going to look at how some of the teams are shaping up for the Tour. But before we do, just a short public announcement. We have a new podcast coming, don't we, Lionel?
We do indeed.
The family is expanding.
It is indeed.
Coming later this week, Service Course by the Cycling Podcast. A lot of you ask us about questions about bikes and tech equipment. We don't know anything about these things at all, do we? But we really don't really. A little bit, but not enough really to speak authoritatively on the topic. So we recognise that there's a need and a demand for a podcast devoted to that side of the sport. And Tom Wally, who's one of our producers and whose voice you will have heard on the Explore series last year, and Kira McVitie, who some of you will know from the Espoir Diaries last year. The two of them, Tom and Kira, are hosting this new podcast, Service Course by the Cycling Podcast. It'll be a monthly show. First one will come out later this week. And I've listened to episode 1 and it's fantastic.
I haven't listened to episode 1 yet. I'm going to listen to it on my way home from London today. Very much looking forward to it, because the challenge we set, Tom and Kira, was to make the business of bicycles and equipment and the technical side of the sport work in audio without people being able to see the equipment that's being talked about. And I think from all of the discussions that we've had, I'm confident that they've cracked it.
Well, I mentioned this new podcast to Rose and Orla while I was at the Women's Tour, and when I initially mentioned it, they both shook their heads and said, doesn't sound like something I'll be interested in. When I then explained the approach they were taking, they both ended up saying, yeah, that does sound interesting, because it's very much about human stories as well. It's about the people as well behind the bikes and the equipment, and there's some fascinating stuff in there about e-bikes. There's an interview with Rob Hales, who it's really his career in bikes, but also he now has a workshop where he repairs carbon bikes as well as many other things, including wedding rings. But that's really good, really interesting. Rob on a subject that he really knows an awful lot about. So it's really good. I thoroughly recommend it. Give it a go.
Service Course will be out on Friday.
It will. Now, let's look ahead again to the Tour de France and the teams and how they're shaping up. I don't think there are many, if any, teams who've really confirmed their lineups. Jumbo-Visma have, I think, more or less confirmed their lineup. But if you refer to the website, Pro Cycling Stats, which we do a lot, there are long lists on there. There are some teams that have confirmed just a few riders. One of the big questions is Team Dimension Data and Mark Cavendish, and whether he will make the team and try to add to his 30 stage wins at the Tour de France. What's the latest on that, Daniel?
I think the latest is that no one really knows, including Mark Cavendish. He rode the Tour of Slovenia over the weekend, where it was 4 stages long, a couple of sprint stages in there. It didn't really feature. There were a couple of nasty climbs towards the end of those stages, so they were quite selective. Cavendish didn't, as I say, really compete in the sprint finishes. His teammate Giacomo Nizzolo won the final stage, which finished in a sprint. And Cavendish hasn't had the best season. He's obviously coming back from Epstein-Barr virus, trying to regain some fitness, trying to regain form, trying to regain some of the racing sharpness he lost through a long period of absence, at the end of last year in particular. And it hasn't quite clicked yet, and it obviously hasn't quite clicked for Dimension Data, which maybe improves his position, his outlook, makes them more likely to pick him. But Doug Ryder, the manager there, will only pick Cavendish, I'm sure, if he thinks that he can pull something out in one of the sprint finishes. Maybe the first stage, maybe his 31st stage win could be could be one that earns him the yellow jersey.
Lionel, if you were Doug Ryder, would you select Mark Cavendish?
Given the options that Dimension Data have, yes, I probably would, because you just never know. You're right, Daniel. You know, there is a chance based purely on kind of know-how and past pedigree, and but you do have to ignore nearly 18 months now, and in fact last year we were talking about having to ignore a year's worth of time where Cavendish really hadn't had any results. And I mean, the Tour of Turkey this year, we saw a flicker of Mark Cavendish finishing third in a sprint and not going to the line. He called it a day with sort of 100 metres to go. It was a sort of not even the old 150 watt light bulb flickering. It was a sort of 30 watt version of Mark Cavendish. I'm talking light bulbs here, not actual watts. I know that might be a bit confusing when talking about cycling, but it was the dimmest of flickers, really. But he took a lot of
encouragement from that, though, at the time.
I think he has. I think he did take some encouragement from that, but there have been various other false starts since then, or times where he perhaps has lost a bit of heart. He's done a lot of different things this year. He's spent time in Mallorca training, done quite a lot of climbing over there. He went to altitude a couple of weeks ago, was in the Alps. Again, these are things that he's not incorporated into his training before. They haven't really produced results yet. Maybe they will further down the line, but it's a difficult decision for Doug Ryder to make, especially with 8-man teams, a team that's really struggled this season. I spoke to Doug Ryder at the Giro. He was talking about going in with a team of opportunists, thinking that, and rightly so, thinking that there are a lot of stages in this Tour de France that might lend themselves to breakaways, to smaller group sprints, but maybe you could consider Mark Cavendish to be part of that sort of strategy of being opportunists, of going in as underdogs to stages, not necessarily having a big lead out train of 4 or 5 guys, but getting involved in a sprint finish and see what happens.
I think the issue isn't even Cavendish. I mean, I'd take Cavendish if I was Dimension Data, simply for the reasons you're saying there, and there's always a chance. But the level of competition is higher than I can really remember it. I mean, just looking at the sprinters who are going to be there, Groenewegen, Ewan, Christoph even had a win a week or so ago, Sagan, Michael Matthews maybe, Viviani, I'm probably missing a couple, but the level is significantly higher, I think, than the times when you could look back and say it was a head-to-head between 1 or 2 guys, and I don't think that that's the case now. I think that the depth is, there is more depth there, and the riders like Groenewegen racking up a couple of wins. Viviani needs to pull something out of the bag after a disappointing Giro. They're all, in terms of what they've achieved so far this season, they are a long way ahead of anything we've seen from Cavendish, for not just this season but for a long time. But like you say, what's the risk? The downside is that you're taking up one of your 8 spots with a rider who may or may not deliver something, who may or may not be out after 8 or 10 days.
Unless you demand, or he demands, a lead-out train of 3 or 4 guys, in which case you are, effectively putting a lot of your eggs in that basket, which probably isn't wise to do at this stage. But if you're thinking about breakaways, getting into a breakaway at the Tour de France is a bit like buying a lottery ticket. The chance of any rider, however good they are in that situation, actually pulling off a breakaway win at the Tour, what is it, 200 to 1, 300 to 1? Is Mark Cavendish's chance of winning a sprint at the Tour de France, winning the first sprint in Brussels, which, let's face it, if he won that would be enough, more than enough. Is it better than 300 to 1? It probably is.
The thing about the breakaways, I mean, no one goes in them. I mean, even last year, you wouldn't have seen Dimension Data riders going in, certainly until the race has kind of settled down a little bit. They've got no one in that perspective lineup that's going to go in.
King.
Not
when it gets harder.
When it gets harder, I mean, but you've got to wait until probably after La Planche de Belfi.
I think there's some really good opportunities this year for guys like Ben King.
I mean, I think it hinges on Cavendish's health, and presumably the team I've been monitoring not just his results in Slovenia, but how he's been riding, how he's been recovering, and what his health is like. And if he is healthy, you could imagine that he's still, that it could just be a tap waiting to be turned on. And if the circumstances are right at the Tour, and at the Tour, although there are all these sprinters there, we were, remember back to 2013 Tour de France, and if you'll recall in Corsica, this huge crash that took out a lot of sprinters, and David Miller ended up second in the bunch sprint. Was it second or third on the bunch sprint? Albeit it was won, I think, by Marcel Kittel, wasn't it? And he was about the only sprinter left. I'm not suggesting that something similar could happen or that we want it to happen, but you just never know. And some of these sprinters might be boxed in or taken out or not there. And Cavendish, with the skills that he has in those situations, there might be a chance. And if he's there, he's the sort of rider who could take that chance. Do
you think they're waiting to see how he does in the British Championships in Norfolk at the weekend?
I'm not sure, Lionel. I'm not sure he even knows exactly what the timeline is on when the choice is going to be made. I think Steve Cummings is in a similar position at Dimension Data. He didn't finish the Dauphiné, was hoping to put in a good performance at the Dauphiné to ride his last Tour de France. Didn't happen. He fell out. Well, he had to pull out with illness. So, there's a lot of uncertainty. I think the one thing you can say with that team and with Cavendish is there isn't anyone obvious waiting in the wings, a young rider whose position he would be taking, whose opportunity Cavendish would be taking if he was thrown in. I still think that he has a decent chance of being selected.
The Cycling Podcast is supported by Science in Sport. Science in Sport. Fueled by science.
Thank you to Science and Sport for their support of the Cycling Podcast, and you can still get 25% off your Science and Sport products with the code SISCP25 SISCP25 at scienceandsport.com. We've still got a few of your questions to get through to put to the Science and Sport experts. If you have a question for the Science and Sport experts, please do email us, contact@thecyclingpodcast.com. Alternatively, you can call in your question. Leave a voice memo on WhatsApp at +44 7971 338 205. That's +44 7971 338 205 if you have a question on sports nutrition to put to the Science and Sport experts.
And you can also send us a voice memo to WhatsApp on that same number for our Tour de France press conference, which we will be recording next week. You can ask any of us a question about the upcoming Tour, the history of the race, this year's route, the food and drink we're looking forward to, anything you like, and we'll try and answer those next week.
Same number. Leave a voice memo on WhatsApp. Looking through the other lineups, chaps, anyone catch your eye? I mean, before we start recording, Daniel, you were mentioning Dan Martin at UAE Team Emirates, a guy who's sort of been flying below the radar, but has ridden pretty well this year. And I read an interview with him in Pro Cycling where he was talking about how much he loves this route, that he thinks it's the best route that he'll get an opportunity to ride in his career.
Yeah, I think it's very mixed. There are lots of different types of terrain. There are steep climbs, there are long, high climbs, there are stages that are neither one thing nor the other, particularly in the Massif Central. So, and I also think it's a day when we're not necessarily going to see trends that are fixed and that are established and then continue for a week or 10 days. I think the contenders are fairly brittle in terms of their experience, their age, and I think we'll see people going back and forth quite a lot. And I think that will suit Dan Martin. He's a guy who will also relish a lot of the sort of very aggressive racing that will take place. I think there are some guys who like to sort of settle into a rhythm, in any given stage, in a given 3-week race, and they like to sort of ride in the wheels, and they don't like things to be broken up too much. And Dan Martin's the opposite of that, and it will be aggressive, and he'll thrive on that. And
there'll be nobody sort of treading on his toes at all in that team, will there? Because with Fernando Gaviria out for the sprints, Fabio Aru missing in action still, although did get through the Tour of Switzerland, but nowhere. He's not on the Tour de France radar. Dan Martin is in a pretty strong position there, isn't he? He can ride his own race exactly the way he wants, and will probably be able to rely on a fair bit of support, I would have thought. But what's really fascinating is, the Tour de France is undoubtedly the biggest event of the season. It's right in the middle of the year, and yet there's so many sort of question marks over so many of the teams. I mean, I know we're not on the inside of these teams, but still it feels quite old school. Some of the teams are putting together their 8-man rosters sort of at the last minute, coping with last minute losses of form or spikes in form, coping with injuries, trying to put together the best roster possible. I know that there are teams that will have taken a much longer term view, and some riders will have had the benefit of knowing a lot further in advance that they're in the Tour's lineup. But there will be a few people that suddenly pressed into action to plug a gap, or certainly with sort of Team Sunweb, for the second Grand Tour in a row, they're having to completely change their objective for the race. The whole thing was going to be built around Tom Dumoulin. He, of course, crashed out of the Giro. He's out of the Tour de France, and now you look at the roster and think, well, will they build around stage wins, or Michael Matthews maybe go for a green jersey again? Remember, he won it a couple of years ago when Peter Sagan was disqualified from the race, but he's someone who could go toe-to-toe with Sagan across 3 weeks. So it's a real... you kind of imagine that every team is approaching the start of the Tour in the best possible shape. Everyone's absolutely firing, ready to go. But in a lot of cases, it can be a case of what's the least bad scenario for them.
I was about to say, I think what we see year after year with the Tour is how risk averse the team managers are, whoever's picking the team. In terms of throwing young riders in just on a sort of whim and a prayer, we've seen it so seldom over the last few years. Thibaut Pinot was one that comes to mind. I think in 2012 he was thrown in, wasn't he, and won a stage in the Jura. But otherwise, it tends to be something that teams prepare riders for almost 2 or 3 years downstream to get into the Tour de France. And we see very old teams, we see very experienced teams, and just looking at the long lists or short lists now, that's reflected in most of the rosters.
One name for you, Thibaut Pinot. It reminds me a bit of 2014 when after Chris Froome crashed out and the race was then very open, and that was the tour where we saw the emergence of Pinot. Pinot's been riding well. I mean, he looks strong. There's always the question of whether the pressure at the Tour might get to him a bit. But what will be his objectives going into the race? Do you think he's going in thinking, I've got a chance of winning this?
And what about the question of weather? If this Central European heat wave is going to hit in the next couple of weeks, what?
Weather. I thought you said weather.
Well, no, it's a play on your use of the word, the other word, weather.
Okay.
Well,
very clever, Lionel.
Pinot will want it to be cold.
Someone's coming to form at the right time.
Pinot will want it to be cold and wet.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think his problem is that he won't relish. I said about Dan Martin. Dan Martin considers himself that someone who is a Tour man, a Tour rider. Pinot does not think of himself in those terms. Doesn't particularly enjoy a lot of the sort of fanfare that comes with the Tour, and that will be amplified by the absence of some of the favourites from this year's race. All of a sudden, his role, the likelihood of him winning has increased, and that's going to put more pressure on him. It's also a first week in which, well, on the one hand, it's an advantage that we get to the mountains pretty quickly. We get to his home region, the Vosges, pretty quickly, so that might settle things. But on the other hand, there are things to think about and dangers and pitfalls on all of the stages pretty much in the first week. And we've seen his Achilles heel in the past has been leaking time, and much the same way as Mikel Landa tends to leak time, just in places where you wouldn't suspect there would even be an issue. Pinot could easily get to the foot of the first mountains in the Vosges 2 or 3 minutes down on general classification, and already sort of under pressure, thinking about maybe targeting stage wins instead. That would be the concern, I think, with him.
Gaudu as well, riding. I'm excited to see what he does. He's a very talented young rider on that team. A guy nobody's talking about is Nairo Quintana. A very strong Movistar team. Mikel Landa is riding, we believe, after a strong Giro. And Alejandro Valverde is obviously going all right again. So it's a really, really strong team, that.
It is a strong team, but do you not think we kind of know what Quintana can and can't do, and so he kind of almost gets damned by faint praise, doesn't he?
Well, it's funny when Daniel was talking earlier about we expect the sort of a new generation to emerge, almost somebody to put down a marker as perhaps becoming like Contador did in 2007. I'm going to be the guy to beat over the next 10 years. If Quintana won, it would not, certainly not feel like that, would it? It would be a strange one. You feel like I mean, he's not old, but you feel like his time has gone, almost has passed. Yeah,
I mean, Daniel used the phrase risk averse, and this Movistar lineup does look, in contrast to the way they raced the Giro, which was, they were on the front foot a fair bit, and then they were smart.
They had a ninth man there, though, didn't they? Don't think Max Chiandri's going to be at the Tour, is he?
I mean, Max did well to take a lot of credit for the Giro win. I mean, but he is a light character, isn't he? He's upbeat. He's quite relaxed, He gives the impression that tomorrow can be better than today, And I think that goes a long way. And it did lighten the atmosphere, certainly around that team. There were a few, even it's a. You often mention this point, Rich. It's a team that we don't get terribly close to, and something we should try to do at the Tour. Maybe go and hang around and see what the facial expressions are like around the Movistar bus. But it felt like a calmer place to be than whereas at the Tour, I don't know. We know what those riders are going to do. We know that Landa will leak time somewhere and be forced to play catch up. We know what Valverde
and
can do.
There'll be a campaign on Twitter to free Landa.
Exactly. Quintana, again, we've said it before, but doesn't have that sort of change of pace to... whenever we've seen him win, he won the short stage last year, didn't he? But it was that kind of... That's all he can do, after the ship has sailed. And
I mean, I also think... I just don't see Quintana beating Bernal now. I think if you put those two head-to-head, Bernal has the edge for me every day, if he can stay upright.
And I'd say Rigoberto Urán is closer to Quintana than he is to Bernal in terms of, he's reliable, but he's not a winner. In the pure sense that he doesn't win stage races. He finishes second or third.
Well, fellas, before we go through the whole start sheet, I'm just trying to avoid any trying to create some kind of audio that we can play back at the end to show how accurate we were in our predictions. But can we end with one wacky prediction from each of you? Wacky prediction.
Well, mine's not that wacky, to be honest, but the break on the opening day of the Tour will have two riders in it. One from 1T Group Gobert and the other from Total Direct Energy. And they will get 3 minutes and then they will be caught.
That's the least wacky prediction.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing wacky about that. Can you identify the riders, please?
Odd Christian Eiking and Damien Godin.
Poor odd Christian Viking at the Dauphiné. He was consigned to the press room for the last day. He spent the whole day in the press room. I think he was sick. And I don't know why there was no seat for him on the team car, on the team bus. But, there he was, sitting, tucking into his sort of reblochon and sourdough bread buffet.
What about you, Daniel?
Well, I'm going to introduce a new concept to the podcast. We've had riding Grand Tours a la Zubeldia. The opposite, the perfect antidote to that is riding Grand Tours a la Atapuma. Riding general classification a la Atapuma. Now... we mentioned Max Chiandri earlier in the podcast. Max Chiandri explained this concept to me at the Giro. Darwin Atapuma has been known to ride general classification. He hasn't had great results in general classifications in the past, but to finish between about 10th and 20th place by deliberately falling out of general classification, deliberately losing time in order to gain time again to get back into general classification. Somewhere later in the race. How do you, as a method, I think it works quite well, because there are some riders who don't like following wheels. They don't like having to concentrate every day and having to sort of suffer in the wheels of ostensibly better riders every day. And maybe that's a shortcut. Maybe that's kind of the lazy way of getting a good good position on general classification.
So who's going to do that this year?
Atapuma. I think he's going to finish 8th riding a la Atapuma.
Okay.
He's got a great nickname, by the way, Darwin Atapuma. I don't know how widespread this is, how well known it is, but he's known, I know, by some riders and staff members of various teams as L'Aquila que tu quieres. The eagle that you love. I don't know why. I don't know whether that you love. It sounds like a Bond film.
But interesting what you say about that method of riding, because it's the opposite to what TJ Van Garderen told us earlier this year about how he couldn't imagine not riding every day for GC and having that kind of pressure, but that sense of purpose that comes.
I like that sort of flaneuring way,
that
kind of lazy way.
Well, Warren Barguil surely could be a candidate for that.
Spending the second week on holiday, basically, just mincing about.
I mean, Barguil,
and then have one good day in the last week.
Barguil,
4th.
A couple of years ago, did lose time earlier on. Didn't remember La Planche de Belfi and all these stages. He was sort of losing time, and it, as we found out later on, it was deliberate. He didn't climb up that far up overall classification.
Obviously,
but
most people do it with the goal of winning stages.
Yeah. No, we'll keep our eyes on that one. That's interesting. My wacky prediction is that Simon Yates will win the Tour de France, having recovered his mojo after the Giro. But just with that, there's nothing wrong with him health-wise. With that work from the Giro in his legs and a bit of a break in between, he goes to the Tour and wins it. I'm not even sure that he's riding.
I think he is.
But we think he is. Yeah, Adam Yates obviously going as leader. But I think if he's healthy and strong, those two, Adam Yates, Simon Yates, could be a very dangerous combination. However, I do see Simon Yates riding a la Atapuma and losing time in the early part of the race, perhaps. So we'll see about that. Anyway, we should wrap things up. We'll be back next week with a press conference. In the meantime, we'll be releasing the first episode of Service Course. Do give that a listen and let us know what you think. A final call out as well for suggestions for a good cause for the mugs that we'll be selling during the Tour de France. All the proceeds from the mugs will go to a good cause. Keep your nominations coming. Send them to contact@thecyclingpodcast.com, and we'll reveal next week which good cause will benefit, and also how you buy one of Stacey Snyder's beautiful mugs. Are you enjoying your mug, Lionel?
It's lovely, isn't it? It's so pleasant to drink out of. Yeah.
And nice and big.
Lovely and big. Perfect for a lovely big cup of tea in the morning.
Absolutely. Well, that's all for now. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lionel.
Thank you, Richard.